we can do so. Well, just keep in mind that now that the tribulation period has ended, we now transition into what is known as the millennial reign. And the phrase 1,000 years, it occurs 6 times, which is pretty interesting, just in Revelation chapter 20, verse 1 through 7, 6 times. And so this period of time is known as what we call the millennial, which if you break that down into its basic form, its millennial is 1,000, and the other part of that is years, so that makes it millennial or 1,000 years. And that's the time of when Christ is going to reign on earth. This is actually the last dispensation in the whole Bible. And we're told that Satan is bound. And if you notice what John says in chapter 20, verse 1 and 2, he says, "And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years." So the devil's chained up. Generation after generation is going to be born during this period of time. The earth is going to flourish just like it was in Eden before the serpent actually seduced mankind. And for 1,000 years, as Satan is bound, there's basically going to be heaven on earth. It's going to be a blissful time for everyone. So this 1,000-year period, make no mistake that it is an actual 1,000 years, because I think God emphasizes it through the verse 1 through 7, that it is the millennial reign of Christ. Oh, hey, I didn't expect to see you guys coming in behind the... Where's the other half?
Forgot to put her mascara on.
Ugh! That woman. So, this is an actual 1,000-year period that we're talking about here. Overall, John says very little about the millennial reign. Why is that? Don't you think this is an important period of time that needs to put a little more emphasis on it rather than 6 verses dedicated in chapter 20? Why would it not be more important? All the other dispensations that we have gone through were given quite the detail. And we get to this one all of a sudden, and John spends very little time telling us anything about it. Well, it's because it's already been fully covered in scores and scores and scores of Old Testament prophecy. It's been covered. There's no need to rehash what's already been told to the Old Testament prophet. So let's look at a few details and exactly what it's going to look like during the millennial reign of Christ. The first thing we can note back in Romans chapter 8, 18 through 22, is that all nature will conspire with the Lord to restore it to its pristine glories of Eden. So when we look at the book of Genesis chapter 1, and when we talk about Eden and as it was then, that's exactly the way it's going to be when we get to the millennial reign of Christ. You're saying, well, how can that be if people already have a sin nature? We're going to talk about that in a few moments. The second thing we notice is that the lion and the lamb will be at peace. There's that age-old song, right? The lion will lay down with the lamb. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. There's not going to be the controversy between the animal kingdom that we have now. You're not going to have the most feared predator, the lion, chasing after the most tame animal, the lamb. It's not going to happen. I don't know that you're going to be as scared of snakes anymore. You're not going to have that fear that you're going to have or that we have now. Thirdly, we see in Isaiah 2 and 4, and a lot of this comes out of Isaiah and Zechariah. It says, swords will be beaten into plowshares. No need, because there won't be any wars. You see, Satan is bound, so you don't have any of that temptation that comes directly from him. The next thing is, so bountiful will be the harvest that the plowman will overtake the reaper in Amos chapter 9, verse 13. So the harvests are just going to it's going to be crazy. Where now, Robbie knows, I know many of you that were raised on a farm, you try to reach a certain yield rate on your farm. Well, you want it to be when you put that combine or that harvester in the field, as soon as you put that header in and it fills up the hopper, that's exactly what you want. Robbie's dad, my brother, everybody that farms, that's exactly what's going to happen during the millennial reign of Christ. that as soon as you stick that harvest, or as soon as you begin to harvest that, it's just going to fill up. You're going to have more big trucks than you know what to do with. Where now we can make by with 12 or 13, whatever the case may be, or the size of your farm. Every person will have a fair share of the world's wealth. Well, this is interesting, isn't it, Jacob? Are we going to be socialist? Can we just go ahead and elect Bernie now and get ready for what's to come in the millennial reign? Come on, Cody, you can think about this one. What's this mean?
I'm not going to say anything.
Come on, come on. There she is, Miss America.
Sorry, I put my mascara on.
We heard. We did hear. It was pre-warned. Okay, Cody refuses to say anything. Refused to say anything about his presidential candidate, Bernie. So, socialism, is that what we're talking about here when we're talking about that every person will have a fair share in the world's wealth? Think about the one I just said previously.
There'll be so much wealth. It's abundant.
It's just abundant, right? There's not going to be a need. It's not like we're going to be sharing the world, but it's going to be so much because your harvest, because the things are going to prosper, because there's not going to be any evil in the world that everyone's going to share in the entire world's wealth. It's not that I have $1 billion and I have to share it all with everybody else. That's not the way that he's talking about right here. Finally, well, not finally, the 12 apostles will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. We see that. And that's going to be an indication of what we're going to talk about in our third point this morning, which we're talking about who's going to occupy the millennial kingdom at that time. Matthew 19:28. Going on, Jerusalem will be the world's capital city. So we're going to see the temple rebuilt. Remember that the Antichrist, he had promised the Jews that he would rebuild their temple. And as a matter of fact, he allowed them to build that temple, but then during the 3.5 year period, the actual middle of the tribulation period, he destroyed that. He broke the peace treaty, everything went away, and then of course we're assuming at this point that it was completely destroyed, or that it was completely destroyed. That will be rebuilt in its glory, and we see in Isaiah 62, 1-7, that will be the world's capital. Jesus will establish that as the capital. Next, all nations will go to Jerusalem to worship. Isaiah 66, 19-20, Zechariah 14, 16-17. Here's what's interesting. Keep this in your mind because it will come back up here shortly. A man will be but a boy at the age of 100. Death will not take us over like it does now. So you think of a person who is in the millennial reign, or who is born, that at 100 years old they're going to be just a child. Right? Think of the amount of, after you marry, think of the amount of kids that you could have over a 1,000-year period. It's a lot of kids. Yeah, Amy's like, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. So at 100, you'll still be but a child, or but a boy. Death will virtually be banished from the earth. You won't have death there, because death is a thing of Satan. Satan is bound at this time. And finally, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters now fill the sea. Everyone will worship God, the knowledge of who he is. So the next big question comes of what is the purpose of the millennial reign? I meant to make that a question and then it comes up, but I obviously didn't do my animation correctly. What is the purpose of it? Is to fulfill the promises of God. Because you have to think about, why is it that we would need a 1,000-year period at the end? Now Satan's bound, and we're going to discuss this a little bit more next week, but why not just put him where he needs to be at the end of the tribulation period and just leave it be? This is now the new earth. Why do we need a 1,000-year period? Well, it's because of this statement. Let's read it. To fulfill the promises God made to the world that cannot be fulfilled while Satan is free and humans have political authority. Okay, so we're going to talk about these promises. Because if God makes a promise, you can bet every dime in your pocket, you can bet everything you have that promise must be fulfilled. And there's a few promises that we're going to talk about this morning that you're going to see that have not come to complete fulfillment. So we have to have those fulfilled before the end of the world, or before everyone, or before we can bound Satan forever. So let's talk about a few of these. The first of all is the royal grant to Abraham. This was the Palestinian covenant, if you will, or the land covenant. It's covered in Deuteronomy 31 through 10. Now, God has already fulfilled the personal aspect, really, of the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham did go to the promised land. He did have a lot of descendants. He is the forefather of many nations. All of that kind of goes into this Abrahamic covenant. Joshua led the Israelites to claim ownership of the promised land. All of that goes into this, but Israel has never actually been this size. So there has to be a time when we're talking about a physical land that Israel physically occupies the royal grant for the Palestinian covenant. This particular, now this is kind of sort of somewhat as it is. And when you go back and you look at exactly what is promised to the 12 tribes of Israel, they're promised strips of land that run from the Mediterranean all the way over to the Euphrates. And I think Dan being the very bottom, I didn't actually put that in here as I was studying, but we know that it is divided out east and west along those lines of latitude. Not even Solomon ruled over this entire area here. You see where his area, 1 Kings 4, 21 through 24. He did reign a lot of land, obviously, but it never ever got to the point that it was promised from the area from Mount Hor, H-O-R, to Hazaranan, which you can find in Numbers 34, 7 through 9. So this has to be fulfilled. They are going to occupy this land, not just for a little bit of time, but God promises that they're going to occupy this land forever. So that goes to show you this promise has to be fulfilled. And you can look at Genesis 13:15, Genesis 17 verse 8. You can also look in Ezekiel 16 and 60. All of that proves to you that whole landmass, now this is Clarence Larkin who's kind of drawn this out based upon what he thinks. It could be bigger, but this whole landmass they still have to possess because God laid it out and God sent them that promise. Questions on that? The second covenant, or the second promise that has not been completely fulfilled, is the Davidic covenant. Let's read it. A kingdom that will have no end. He says in 2 Samuel 7:16, "And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever." Can you think about the Davidic covenant, the throne of David? And can you name a time in history where Israel has been established in power forever? God made a promise right here, the Davidic covenant. It must come true. If God says it, it's going to happen. It has not happened yet, so therefore we have to say that this still must come. So the biblical scholars agree that Jesus is part of this whole Davidic covenant because he's going to sit on the throne of David. And that's one reason, I guess, that you can see that his genealogy for both his adoptive father and his mother are actually put in there so that they can take that lineage all the way down. The Jews understood this when they laid down the palm branches in their cloaks before Jesus rode into Jerusalem. They really expected what? A political leader, or a military leader that was going to liberate them from all of the Roman Empire. That they were going to make Israel a great nation, or that Jesus was going to make Israel a great nation again. But they didn't understand the work of what Jesus actually was here to do. So this 1,000-year reign is going to be a time when that promise is going to be taken by Jesus Christ, and he's going to sit on the throne forever. Never to be dethroned again. Finally, the third promise that must be, the third covenant promise that needs to be fulfilled If we look under Jeremiah 31 through 34, the work of the new covenant. So when we see Jesus' death and the resurrection to reconcile hearts to God, that part has been accomplished at this period of time that we're talking about. But what we've not yet come to see is the complete fulfillment of this. Notice what he says in Jeremiah 13:33. It says, "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people." Now, it's not that they don't believe in the Jehovah God, I was talking about the Jews, the Israelites, that they don't believe in the God that we believe in, but they don't believe in Jesus. And when he's talking here specifically, he's saying Jesus. So in Isaiah 59:20 through 21, it explains the covenant, and it's possible because of the Redeemer. And of course, all of this means that the nation will submit after the tribulation period to Jesus being who he was when he came the first time. That's got to be fulfilled. When the Old Testament prophets who spoke of this covenant, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, when they all wrote this, it was about this fulfillment in the future. So from this time on, in the millennial reign, you're going to see all of the Jews, all of the Israelites worship Jesus Christ as their Messiah, as the rightful king that he is. Those covenants must be fulfilled. Now let's talk about a couple more promises. They're not necessarily covenants, but we're going to talk about a couple more promises here. Just ones that I picked out as we go through here. God promised Jesus that he'll make his enemies a footstool and that Jesus' followers will worship him freely. Psalms 100. So you see that they have not been made a footstool yet, but they are going to worship him freely. Second, God promises the nations of the world that they would live in peace with Jesus as their ruler. Has that ever happened? No, not yet, but it will. The third thing that I found was God promises creation that the curse would be lifted in Romans. Animals in the earth would be restored to peace and prosperity. We talked about that just a few moments ago. And the last promise that I could find as I was going through, God promised people would be freed from disease, Ezekiel 34:16, which, by the way, will also go along with people living a very, very long time. We won't have to worry about cancer. We won't have to worry about any other disease that comes along. Now then, we talked and slightly got to the top of this last week. Who's going to occupy the millennial kingdom? Before we get into this, give me your guesses. Who's going to occupy the millennial kingdom? Are you, Cole? Don't shake your head no. That makes me scared for you.
Old saints, it says the apostles, 12 apostles will be ruling it.
Okay.
So old saints.
I like that. I like that. Who else?
Those that survive the tribulation.
Those that survive the tribulation. Are they Gentiles or are they Israelites?
Both.
I don't know. Not a prophet.
I don't know. I mean, I guess anybody could.
Anybody that's a believer?
I like that. That's exactly right. Anybody that's a believer. So there will be those on earth who survive the tribulation, who have not taken the mark of the beast, who have not followed the Antichrist, who have believed in Jesus Christ, that will transition from the tribulation period, that 7-year period of wrath, directly into the millennial reign. So we have humans on earth, and humans have what? What are we born with? Bodies, a sin nature. That's what I'm looking for, a sin nature. This ought to give you an indication at the end of the 1,000 years where Satan is going to get his masses to come up and fight Jesus for the very last time. Okay? So let's look at this. Individually, 2 groups of people. If we want to divide them out by 2 groups, we're going to do it by their bodily state. First one, those with glorified bodies. So y'all hit upon that very, very, very good here. It says, If you look at chapter 20, verse 4, and it says, "And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them." So we see here, those are the ones who include the church. Who is the church? Which is kind of interesting here because some people don't understand who the church is. Who's the church?
Saved people.
Are you the church?
Absolutely. Married
Every
to
one of
Christ.
us, if you've accepted Jesus Christ, we are the church. So we're going to be there, but that also not necessarily under the church, but of those in glorified body. I wish I had done this different now that I'm looking at it. Is exactly what Cody said, is all those other saints from ages past. Because you see, Moses and all the other prophets in the Old Testament, they're not a part of the church. When was the church established?
After the resurrection.
After the resurrection.
Well,
We'll call it the day of Pentecost, really. I guess if we wanted to call it that. Well, maybe even before that. Jesus kind of established the church with that. But yeah, so the church established after Jesus' death. Right? Or I guess you could say maybe he established it with his apostles during that particular time. Maybe churches were established then. Would y'all? I think that would be a better statement if you wanted to call it a church, maybe. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that before I go.
I mean, he
But we
sent the
do
Holy
know.
Spirit.
Do what now?
But he sent the Holy Spirit, and that's when he told them, "You gotta go."
True.
They dispersed.
Okay, so the church is definitely a part of that. That didn't happen. So all the Old Testament saints weren't a part of the church. It was a mystery to them. That was the way it was referred to in the Old Testament. That's the reason Paul said that I now tell you about the mystery. So we have the Old Testament saints that will be there as well during this period of time. But there are going to be those with glorified bodies. Can those with glorified bodies reproduce during this time?
No.
Absolutely not. Okay? You've already been... there is no reproduction in heaven when it comes to that. Now, the second group of people are those who died during the tribulation that refused to worship the beast. Why aren't they a part of the church? No trick question here. Why aren't these people who died during the millennial or during the tribulation, why aren't they a part of the church?
They didn't accept Christ.
When was the church raptured?
When Christ came.
At the beginning of the tribulation. So these martyred people, because of their belief, because they refuse to follow the beast, they will also be here ruling with us. You can look through Revelation 1 all the way through 4. It maybe even covers it in verse 6. But those people are the ones who are going to have earthly bodies that are going to rule with Christ in glorified bodies. The second group of people are those who have earthly bodies. Now there's three groups that we're going to break this down into. I'm going to do it relatively quickly since we only have a few minutes here. We have believing Gentiles. Like Rick said, there will be those who are Gentiles who have accepted Jesus Christ, who decide to follow Jesus Christ, and they will survive the tribulation period. What happens to the unbelieving Gentiles? Why didn't I say unbelieving Gentiles? Why aren't they here? Because of the Battle of Armageddon. They were slain. The birds came and ate their flesh. They're gone. Okay? Everyone left on earth at this time is a believer. At the very beginning of the millennial reign is a believer. Second of all, Israel. The children of Israel, because they will have believed. Remember, the entire tribulation period, that 7-year period, was directed towards the nation of Israel. Directed towards God's people. Yes, Gentiles were affected, but it was so that God's people would realize who the King of Kings is. So that they would raise their eyes to know exactly who Jesus was. And then the third group of people are the children that will be born. Now, how many children do you think are going to be born over this period of time?
Millions.
Yes, millions of children. So as the ages roll on, millions of children are going to be born who have never known a world that you and I know right now. Not ravaged by sin, not ravaged by war, pestilence, crime. They're not going to know any of that. Although that they will be born during this time, they're still going to have that Adamic nature, that sin nature, that's going to have them make a decision during the millennial reign of do they need to be saved or not. So will they have to accept Jesus Christ as their Savior? Absolutely they will. They will have to make the decision during the millennial reign. Right? That has to be a decision. They will also, well, I don't want to say this, but they will have to make the decision to be born again. So as time goes on, more and more of these individuals here, they will follow because they are doing it out of duty. Does Jesus Christ want you to do something out of duty?
Free will. Want you to do it out of free will and love.
But they're going to do it because
They won't know what the consequences of sin is because
Right.
Satan's not here.
these will resent that iron discipline of the kingdom. Although it be righteous, they're going to resent it. It's going to build up, and after 1,000 years, these are going to be the ones who are going to be the four corners of the earth that he talks about in Revelation chapter 6, that when Satan is loosed, he will gather those together, and they will come and they will battle against Jesus for the final time. So the question is, do you understand why we have to have the 1,000-year millennial reign? Because he can't accomplish it with Satan on earth. Or I guess he could, but he's going to accomplish it. He can't get everyone to worship like he wants to. So therefore, that 1,000 years has to be so that those covenants will be fulfilled, and they will be. All those promises have to be fulfilled. At the 1,000-year, end of the 1,000-year, which is where we're going to talk about next week, we're going to talk about when Satan is loosed and what happens in that period of time. Questions, comments? Nothing? No hard questions? Cody, Haley, start with y'all. Nothing? Carter's have nothing?
Harder time, nothing.
Okay. No, nothing at all before we dismiss. Let's bow our heads then. Father,